My name is Meenal Jain and I shall be the moderator for this round. Welcome to the fourth edition of the 404 International Debate Competition organized by Vijaybhoomi University. Vijaybhoomi is one of a kind university located in the serene valley of Karjat in close proximity to Mumbai city. It is a unique institution which allows the students access to the courses that are career oriented and encourages creativity and innovation. Firstly, I would like to introduce you to the judge for today's round. We are really happy to have Professor Edwin Moses, a distinguished faculty of Jagdish Sheth School of Management. A global P&L leader with 30 years of corporate experience. He brings forward a unique value proposition wherever his expertise takes him. We are privileged to have you here with us, sir, today.
Speech in 3, 2, 1. Good morning to everyone present here. Myself, as the Prime Minister, would first like to define the motion. This motion has three main key points. First, climate change. Climate change is the significant change of weather conditions, rather it being warmer and drier, over several decades or even longer. The second key point is international action. Any international institution or a group of countries which come together and take an action against a specific nation or state for their betterment or even against them is termed as international action. Now, sovereign nations. Sovereign nations is any nation that does not require any other country to intervene in its personal affairs, nor do they do. It is an ideology proposed in the post-colonization. Well, this motion here is not that country wages wars or imposes sanctions on poor countries. It is that there will be a consequence for the times the countries take their goals leisurely. And the goal is here that country battles the issue together. The efforts to combat climate change should involve international measures against the sovereign countries, such as sanctions against the sovereign nations that either directly contribute to the environmental abuses or fail to take necessary actions to prevent such abuses. Now, Barack Obama once stated that climate change is no longer some far off problem. It is happening here. It is happening now. Now, to give a reality check, first of all, let me tell you about the detrimental effects that these abuses have on the society as well as on the environment. Now, the environmental effects includes that these abuses brought about a range of detrimental environmental consequences, causing profound disruptions in ecosystems and human communities. More frequent and intense storm results in extensive property damage and loss of human life. Furthermore, shifts the climate pattern, disrupts habitats, threatens biodiversity, and can lead to spread of diseases. These harmful consequences collectively endanger the delicate balance of our planet's natural systems, impacting both the environment as well as the well-being of the citizens of the nation. Now, the social effects. Now, this also leads to climate change, right? So, the climate change has severe social consequences, causing harm to vulnerable populations, disrupting agriculture and water resources, leading to food insecurity, and causing displacement of coastal communities. Extreme weather events strain healthcare systems, disrupt education, and disrupt critical infrastructure, putting additional burdens on marginalized communities and threatening social stability. These impacts worsen the existing inequalities among the society and threaten the social stability worldwide. Now, the political effects. Climate-induced migration and displaced populations are worsened by the border disputes and political instability. Social inequalities are amplified, and governments must divert the resources for disaster response, straining public finances and causing an unrest. Now, the economic causes. Rising temperature and extreme weather events cause increased costs for the disaster recovery, infrastructure repair, and the insurance claims. Now, climate shifts disrupts the agricultural system, as stated before, increases food prices, and straining the household budgets. Coastal regions faces risks from sea level rise, damaging business and property values. Extreme weather events and supply chain disruptions can lead to economic instability and job losses, particularly in the vulnerable communities. Climate change has significant economic implications requiring decisive action. Now, to conclude this point, climate change's far-reaching impacts encompasses the environment, society, politics, and the economy. It disrupts the ecosystem, threatens the health, fosters inequality, and burdens economies. To combat these harmful effects, an international collaborative effort is imperative. Climate change demands our immediate attention and unified action, not only for the sake of the environment, but also to safeguard the well-being of the citizens of the nation. Now, developed nations have more carbon emission than developing countries. Thus, the developed countries are held the most responsible for problem of climate change, meaning that developed countries shall have more sanctions than the developing countries, who are comparatively less responsible for the climate change. To make this more practical, let me tell you on how we can implement it. We should impose huge fines on developed countries like America, UK, France, Germany, Austria, etc. And these fines are then given to poor countries to help them financially and technologically help them to fight this climate change. Then we should impose minimum sanctions on medium-sized developing countries like China, India, Brazil, Russia, etc. And finally, make only diplomatic pressure on poor developing countries like the African countries, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, etc. Let me also inform you all about one major effort made by the European Parliament for this issue. To tackle climate change, the European Parliament adopted the European Climate Law, which raises the EU, which is the European Union's target of reducing the net greenhouse gas emissions at least by 55% by 2030, and makes climate neutrality by 2050 legally binding. In conclusion, I have presented compelling arguments highlighting the potential negative impact of climate change and also giving reasons on why international effort is required. I have also provided you with suitable examples to support our claims. Panel, I hope I have proved to you our case, and thank you for taking all interest in the movement.
Esteemed judges and fellow debaters, today I stand here to express my complete and utter rejection of the motion that the government proposes. I would like to begin my speech by letting the government know that despite their eloquent expression of their views, my stance remains unchanged, that it would not be appropriate, possible or ideal to use severe international punishments. Furthermore, it would end up harming everybody in the long run if we decided to implement such measures against certain countries. As we emphasize that we believe climate change is the biggest, most pressing issue of the generation, we as the opposition don't see this as a situation where punitive measures are used as the government so strongly supports. Yes, as the threat of mass extinction, the specter of pollution and the proliferation in fossil fuel all multiply, we have to do something about it. And if the government understands the motion well, and provided they have a moral compass, they might just steer away from the dangerous opinion they are espousing. What the government believes in is that international organizations and great powers should be able to harm entire countries. We are not talking about just the PM and the president of the country, but we are talking about every single human and non-human entity that makes up the life and soul of what you'd call a country. After all, the climate crisis is a challenge that can only be solved through international cooperation. The transition to a sustainable world must be shaped within a political world order based on multilateral agreements. community, and cooperation. Sanctions or the exclusion from international negotiations would only have the opposite effect and make joint efforts even more difficult. Once states are lost as cooperation partners through exclusion from negotiations, it will be all the more difficult to bring them back on board. Judges and the Prime Minister and the deputies and all my fellow debaters at this forum. Truly, international action never happened. Not all countries, except the ones being targeted, will be ready to pool their resources and send their militaries to fight when they know that once this nation has achieved a sense of security pertaining to climate change, their nation might be next, at whose place this grim reaper called punitive measures is knocking next. And yes, I do not take the grim reaper lightly. I mean it when I say that such measures will spell out demise for the countries attacked. Then the question arises, not just about the thought of the government, but also how difficult the execution might be. Last time I remember, it took a nuclear bomb to unite the world behind a common cause. Excluding them from international organizations or putting sanctions on them right away is likewise a tried and tested recipe for disaster. How so? Well, this will not harm the richest of the rich in their country with vested interests. But for countries who suffer from subsistence crisis, doing so would be like sentencing to death by starvation to its citizens. At this point, many developing and underdeveloped nations rely heavily on international aid, which is acquired by the membership of international organizations. And this is perhaps the reason why this problem exists in the first place. Because the aid is not sufficient, the governments of these nations end up having to make a sacrifice. Yes, it isn't the noblest thing that a country can do, but most nations end up on the conclusion that their job is to prevent poverty and starvation and death. So it is a death sentence for these nations. Yes, it is true that some of the violators include big, powerful nations. But cognizant of the fact that these countries have the international organizations under a stranglehold, including the vetoing power that they have. I think we have enough good examples of why governments should not show false righteousness by literally tearing up another country which hadn't even shown aggression against them just in the name of principles like liberty and war on terrorism. While these are noble principles, the murder of innocent civilians is as much of an insult to these principles as any opposition to them. War will bring on further environmental consequences, which would be a great offense on both sides. Pertaining to the war in Ukraine, OECD commented, the war has caused widespread and severe damage to the environment and inflicted both immediate and long-term consequences on the human health, ecosystems, and the Ukrainian economy and beyond. And recommended that in the longer term, post-war green reconstruction should not be seen as a desirable but optional extra, but as an economic necessity for a fundamental transition of Ukraine towards a green and net zero economy. Then how exactly is war justified? Not just the environment. As I have spoken earlier, it is also a lot about the civilians, advocating for bringing out the guns and tanks to protect the pursuit of sustainable goals is about the most unwise thing we can do. In conclusion, the crux of this argument lies in understanding the grave mistake the government would be committing by forcing governments to take action by harming civilians. As recent events have shown, it is never ever justified to even bruise the individual civilian in pursuit of anything. It is understanding how positive reinforcement works and by paying heed to how it can be utilized, as will be elaborated by my fellow opposition leader. Judges, fellow debaters, and our esteemed audience, we would like to end this argument of this segment of the House by reiterating it is unjustified to harm entire countries just because of their reckless leaders. It will always end in pain and misery again and again, as time has proven again. Let us believe in the inherent moral and emotional aspect of us humans that we will always do things intentionally when there is a net profit for us in the fray. Punishment is the cornerstone of establishing fear, and fear brings no good. Therefore, I rest my case.
Namaskar and warm greetings to all present here, dear audience, respected jury, more than worthy opponents and fellow teammates. I, as the Deputy Prime Minister, stand here to advocate on a simple deal. Whether criminals should be punished or not. Or that should the fight against climate change include taking internal action against sovereign countries which allow environmental abuse through their negligence. Because I barely see any difference between the two. Now, moving further into this debate, I would first like to tell you about a tale about the Paris Agreement. It was signed in 2015 with a target set to acknowledge and reduce the carbon emissions, and it was also recognized the effect of developed countries on carbon emissions and their duty to help the underdeveloped countries. And this reflected the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Now, America, being one of the developed countries, had to fund the underdeveloped countries. But it suddenly, abruptly quitted the agreement. And now, what were the consequences, you may ask, ladies and gentlemen? But there were none consequences. There was no consequence of a country abruptly leaving this agreement. Now, this is where the Paris Agreement went wrong. And while it did great with the CBDR rule, it didn't hold any consequence for a country which did not meet its target. And now, we all have heard about wolves in sheep clothing. This is exactly what most of the developed countries right now are like. Let me explain. They are still bent towards their own progress, even though they are pretty developed. They still keep testing nuclear weapons and waging wars. And this is what it makes inevitable to have to resort to stricter policies. I would also like to introduce you to the concept of pseudo-policies. Pseudo-policies are the policies which are made as rules, but they are not implemented in reality. For example, it is a rule that every car should have pollution control certification, but in Delhi, over 2 million cars don't have pollution control certification. And this is why we say that we need to resort to stricter policies, my dear opponent. Next, I would say that you still may argue that we should not be using extreme methods when developed nations can help the underdevelopments and we all can live happily together as a big happy family. But for this, let me tell you another tale. This is of Brazil. So recently, the lungs of earth, that is, the Amazon forest, has been facing deforestation on a large scale, and the government again did absolutely nothing to prevent this. So this right here is the proof of how absolutely the governments have not been taking enough steps to help solve this major issue. It is high time, because if this leisure attitude continues, we are done for. This earth is done for, and even the voiceless, speechless creatures in the earth are done for, all because of the great deeds we people have done. And let me remind you, we belong to the earth. It is not the other way around. Now that we have digested the complexity of this issue, I will move on to introducing a solution. The motion here is not that countries wage wars or impose sanctions, or poor countries, as you said, that they should not be imposing sanctions. But over here, the problem is that we need to make rules. We need to make provisions that make sure that corporations, the rules in it are abided in a proper manner. The evidence of this being the Paris Agreement again. And by this, I mean that consequences be altered depending on the country. The Prime Minister had also previously stated this, that the developed countries, they are able to
face and hold against huge fines. While the underdeveloped countries are not able to, and this is why it is best that they only suffer from diplomatic pressure. And the international institutions can also put pressures on the nations, as I just mentioned, or threaten to exclude them from the organization, which can create tons of pressure on them. For example, EU, the European Union. It provides several benefits to all countries in it, as there is no need for visa and there are also a lot of trade benefits. Threatening the nations with all of this at stake, it might actually help the government and it will force them to work towards their goals. Also, sanctions such as tourism, trade, carbon, or funded projects can also be imposed on countries. As I previously said, the one size fits all approach is not suitable in this case. We need to analyze, we need to understand, and then decide upon which kind of sanction, which kind of the punishment that can be given to a country, the consequence that they might have to face as someone who has taken a huge deal as climate action so leisurely. To conclude my case, I would quote that climate change knows no border. It is a global issue that requires international action. So whether sovereign or not, whether developed or not, whether rich or not, it is high time. Or maybe you know what, it still isn't high time. We still aren't carrying oxygen cylinders on our back as if they are perfume bottles. We still don't have oxygen cylinders in place of the bus stations. Yes. Now, all of this, as I previously stated, is due to the great deeds done by we humans. And we should become more stern and severe to do whatever it takes so that we actually don't reach that high time. With this, I would like to rest my case now. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Good morning, audience. Good morning, Judge. Good morning to all my fellow debaters. I would first like to acknowledge the point that has been made by the Deputy PM, and I would like to counter it. So, she said that criminals, she is talking about punishing criminals. But when you read the motion again, it is not talking about punishing governments. It's talking about punishing countries. It's talking about, and a country is not just the government. A country is not just the parliament house. A country is millions of people, their families. And it's not just people. A country is way more than the government. So punishing the people, however rich they might be, however poor they might be, is fundamentally wrong. And that is at the core of my argument. That we should target the government rather than sovereign countries themselves. We are excluding these countries from international organizations. Because when they will be in the international organizations, because this is part of the motion, when they will be part of the international organizations, they will have the rules applied to them. When they are not in the international organization, how can you enforce the rules on them? This is the first point. The second point is, my opponents, both the PM and the Deputy PM, made the point that the richer countries or the more developed countries are the ones who are responsible for more emissions. This is indeed true, but they have the resources. And yes, I accept that they have done it slowly, but they have the resources to invest, and they have invested those resources into transitioning towards sustainable development. Countries who have not yet reached conventional development yet, how will they move to sustainable development when they do not have the access to the funds? And as soon as they get into this developed category, they are being targeted with sanctions and all. So, by excluding these countries, we are putting the people of this country at a disadvantage. Imagine there's a developing country to which international aid is stopped because you didn't meet this climate target, and whose multilateral organizations memberships are suspended. They don't have the loans, they don't have the money, it's bankrupt, and the people of the nation are dying of hunger. I would like to say that there are more immediate concerns. I agree. Climate change is the most pressing issue of this generation. However, by punishing countries, what we are doing is we are helping countries cannot focus on their more immediate concerns. They are not focusing on do or die things. Yes, I agree, climate change is something that every single country needs to work towards. But for that, punishment is not going to work. Also, sovereignty. Sovereign countries, because, and again, I'm referring straight to the motion, it refers to military intervention. This is very, very wrong. Breaching of sovereignty. What is war? Breaching of sovereignty. And as my fellow leader, the leader of opposition said, war or use of force to defend principles is not justifiable. The murder of civilians is not justifiable by any principles. And it's an aggressive breach of sovereignty. It goes against sustainable development goals, UN Sustainable Development Goal number 16, peace, justice and strong institutions. And our goal is sustainable development. When we want to go towards sustainable development, let's bring countries on. Let's give them support rather than punishing them, rather than bombarding them with consequences. Sustainable development is the ultimate goal, and it cannot be achieved as a result of force. When this force will be applied, either they'll do the bare minimum or it will lead to sheer chaos and war, which will be harmful for the civilians. And I, as the opposition, I speak not on the behalf of these governments, who I believe should face consequences, but I speak on behalf of the citizens, of the innocent civilians of these countries who will be at loss if the government's suggestions are accepted. And by hindrance of growth by predatory sanctions. You know what sanctions do. You know how they impact the whole world. It's not just the country impacted. In the Russia-Ukraine war, yes, Russia deserved some consequences. But you know what happened next? The whole world has plunged into a recession as a result of the sanctions, because it's a big trading partner. Also, as I would like to reiterate my point again about international organizations. Who is going to implement this? Because this is talking about international actions, of course, international agencies are going to implement it. And these international agencies, they are completely under the stranglehold and control and the vetoing power of these developed nations. So you cannot attack either the developed nations, and attacking the developed nations is morally wrong. My main point here is positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement never works in the long term. It is the policy of fear, inspiring fear, using fear as the cornerstone of your arguments, or using fear as a way to incite things. Incentives, always. Humans inherently have a greed. We can channelize that positively by giving them incentives. One of the things I propose is that we should give preference and candidacy for the non-permanent membership of the UN Security Council to the countries who achieve more of the sustainable development goals, who are working to combat climate change. So, as I would like to end my argument by saying that we should target the criminals. I agree with her. We should punish the criminals. But the criminals are not the countries. They are the reckless governments. They are the reckless figureheads. They need to be attacked, not the countries. And no use of force and no use of these forceful sanctions is justifiable at any cost. With that, I rest my case.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, judges, and esteemed debaters, I stand before you today to address a matter of actual global importance, international action on environmental abuses, and pressing issue of climate change. These twin challenges are intertwined and not just crisis, global threat. Next, nuclear bomb to unite world, again said by leader of opposition. What about the sufferers of the Israel-Palestine war, Russia and Ukraine war? Are they not suffering of the nuclear bombs that you wanted, that you said help in development? Stating next, false rightness. False rightness, you say. When you blame these countries, you talk about false rightness. False rightness to the countries who are responsible for the climate change, which is leading to deaths of people and causing harm to people. Really? Talking next, harming civilians, stated by leader of opposition. I would like to answer you by a short poem. Hear it out. What you actually call harm is harm not at all. It is instead a way to ensure me and you are alive and have open eyes to look at next generations alive and not be part of the list of deaths caused by such a silly reason to be for. Next, target governments instead of countries, said by deputy leader of opposition. Do you know how countries are formed? Countries are formed with citizens. Citizens include the industrialists and businessmen who are responsible for various carbon emissions, which further leads to climate change. Right? Next. So you talked about sustainable goals, right? How sustainable goals and how are we going to implement them? Funds, everything. Do you know the conference that happened in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil? Yes, right. So there we already took action of Agenda 21. And there the countries are already implementing the sustainable goals. Talking about innocent civilians. Again, innocent civilians include the businessman and industrialists who are responsible for this. And that's why we are here to discuss that topic. And next, attacking morally wrong. Okay, morally wrong. Do you even know what is the meaning of morally wrong? Do you even know what are morals? When you are responsible for taking someone's life, is that called as being moral? No, sir, it's not being moral. Next. Now I would like to state my arguments. Climate change. Climate change is a worldwide emergency demanding a unified solution. It affects the whole globe, not a country alone. It's very necessary to initiate global measures against the nations responsible. Accountability plays a very major role in fostering more sustainable and social society. Why should we tolerate the risk of global harm due to these selected countries that affect the people's life? Then you talk about punitive measures. As each person, for example, each person has commitments in their life. So basically, why can't we have global commitments to solve the solutions? Rather, we all should come one, have global commitments and solve this problem too. Talking about the Paris Agreement, that was successful, restricts global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. So if the countries do not follow or go against it, you have the countries encounter repercussions and sanctions too. Talking next, elaborating on this point, the climate change. The climate change harms the vulnerable groups. Vulnerable groups, small island groups and everything. It can also become a cause for extinction of these groups. So in this case, we are actually taking a group of civilians out from the world. Now I would like to state some examples. Historically, European countries, in the European countries we have this coal burning plants which release sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, due to which this was mostly done by the countries that include UK and Germany, due to which it affected an acid rain and affected the countries, the neighboring countries like Sweden and Norway, and further damages. Talking about the Russia-Ukraine war that started in 2014, it just didn't even create consequences just in Ukraine. It also took consequences outside. Same with Israel and Palestine war. Next we have Indo-Gangetic Plains example. So this basically, do you all know what South Asian brown cloud is? It was a typical haze caused due to the pollution taken the countries that included India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. the pollution caused here took away and affected Nepal and Sri Lanka and the countries involved in that. Similarly, we have Black Triangle example. In this, we had countries from Europe being involved. For example, we had Poland, we had Germany. So in this case, this area was considered as one of the world's polluted area, and the reason why, again, industrial activities, the citizens. So in conclusion, here we are for this debate to look forward that all countries cooperate and come up with a unified solution. Here I rest my case. Thank you.
Before starting with my arguments, I would like to say that I'll only be taking POIs after my 5 minutes are over, and I'll start in 3. Although arguments stated before me were incredibly plausible, but my opinion still remains unchanged. And as a member of government, I condemn the motion at hand. This House believes that the fight against climate change should include taking international action against sovereign countries, which allow environmental abuses through direct actions or negligence. So let's break through and explore some of the arguments. Climate change is a global crisis with far-reaching consequences. The idea of talking about international actions against sovereign countries that contributes to environmental abuses is rooted in the belief that holding nations accountable for their actions can be an effective way to combat climate change. This was said by the proposition that taking strong actions against sovereign countries is the way to address climate change. However, isn't international cooperation essential in combating climate change? Talking about the actions against sovereign countries, against diplomatic relations, and make it difficult to achieve global consensus. For example, the diplomatic approach taken in the Kyoto Protocol, implemented in 2005, led to emission reduction targets and cooperation among nations. Secondly, by working together with countries, we can create a united front against climate change. Punitive actions may hinder this cooperation and lead to more environmental harm in long run. As seen in the conflicts like the trade war between between USA and China, which disrupts international collaboration. Now, I would like to remind this House what Paris Agreement was. It was an example of a diplomatic approach to addressing climate change and encourages countries to voluntarily, I repeat, voluntarily commit to reducing their greenhouse emissions by encouraging nations in dialogue and negotiations. It seeks to create a consensus for action, not for conflict. We advocate for peaceful revolutions and negotiations as a means to encourage countries to adopt internationally friendly policies. The use of sanctions and military interventions can lead to conflict and further harm the environment. An illustration example is the Niger Delta conflict in Nigeria. The region has been plagued by the oil-related environmental abuses, leading to conflict and environmental degradation. The government's use of military interventions and the lack of peaceful dialogue exacerbated the situation, causing further harm to the environment and escalating tensions. Now, promoting dialogue and peaceful negotiations allow for more ambiguous resolution, reducing the chance of military conflicts and the harm they can cause. Thus, we demand peaceful means over aggressive actions. Thirdly, I would like to put forward a question. Don't you think punishing nations for environmental abuses might unintentionally harm innocent people within those countries, especially if you're talking about military interventions? Instead, why are we not prioritizing helping these vulnerable countries and communities by fostering sustainable activities rather than punitive measures? An example, as already stated by the opening opposition, was the aftermath of 2011 disaster in Japan, where punitive measures have not only further affected the communities but also destroyed them. Okay, initiatives that consider the welfare of the people and the communities in environmentally challenging nations can lead to more ethical and effective outcomes. Now, in many developing nations, let's talk about the example of India itself. Access to cutting green technologies can be limited due to financial constraints. From a humanitarian perspective, it's essential to prioritize helping these nations acquire and implement sustainable technologies. International organizations and international corporations should focus on technology transfer and capacity building, ensuring that countries can adopt greener practices without leaving their people behind. I think we all know about the Green Climate Fund established in 2010, a prime example of international cooperation to address this issue. It aims to provide the financial support for developing countries to implement green technologies and transition to sustainable practices. This initiative ensures that countries can adopt greener and cleaner practices without leaving their people behind. Yes, I would like to take a view.
You mentioned about innocent people being harmed due to policies such as sanctions. Do you know when a country is sanctioned, the people will, yes, they will be harmed. But when the people are harmed, the government is pressurized. When the government is pressurized, the government will actually take some action. Also, coming to the aspect of military intervention, I would request you to look up to its definition again. Military intervention is not waging wars, it is stopping wars. It stops a war between two countries. There's a clear difference, and I don't know how even the Deputy Prime Minister and even you are confusing those two things. Military intervention is not equal to waging wars.
Okay, first stating with the word which you said may harm the people. The ethical values which are leading you to say may harm the people, the line which is so wrong, I'm going to focus on that. I know that the government should be pressurized, as said by the opening opposition. The government should be pressurized, not the nation. And today's topic is the nation, I assume. So yeah. Talking about military interventions, yes. Let's take an example of countries like Syria, where they can't feed their people. The country is on the verge of starvation. They have a falling economy. How can you accept countries like these to come up and contribute to environmental crisis? Thank you.
Esteemed judges and my fellow participants, today's debate can be minimalized to a basic question. If there were no jails, would there be crimes or would there be lesser crimes? Jails is the only reason why people are bound to follow the rules. If there were no strict measures implied on countries who are responsible for climate change, they would be free horses. They would destroy the whole world. And why would other countries suffer due to the extreme amounts of carbon emissions which are sent out by developed countries like USA and China, and also by developing countries like India itself? Talking about a point raised by the opposition, countries are millions of people who have families, whose lives matter as well. Won't their lives be endangered if no actions were taken against climate change? It is not just non-violence which played a major role in freeing India. It was the Azad Hind Fauj as well. A pivotal decision as the innovation of nuclear bomb or its falling on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a terrible incident. I accept it. But did it not bring global peace afterwards? It was a pivotal decision taken by numerous countries to ensure that the world stayed as whole. a very recent event, the Russia-Ukraine war. During the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia did violate the Articles 52, 54 and 56 chartered by the UNEP, which state that environmental damage should not be caused during a warfare. These articles were barred by Russia, but it was not sanctioned for it. It was sanctioned for the violence it did, which is acceptable. But what about the environmental damage it caused? In the past year itself, nearly $7 trillion was spent in subsidizing fossil fuels. Will this money not be more efficiently spent in ensuring more renewable energy to be produced? Investing in renewable energies cuts emissions, contributes to job creation and economic growth as well. There is a goal of $100 billion to be collected by all the countries around the world unanimously in order to ensure climate change. Since the past few decades, since this has been implemented, never, I repeat, never has it ever been achieved. In the past year, it was short of $20 billion. Is this not a proof that the urgency of the situation is not assessed properly? Pondering upon the point mentioned by the DPO about the lack of funds given to developing countries to ensure the climate change policies, the UN General Secretary has asked and also more accurately ordered to reform World Banks and other development banks to make them fit for this purpose. But even when the funds were allotted to developing countries, no change, I repeat, no change has been seen. As the government whip, I would like to mention the points discussed. The withdrawal of US from the Paris Act in 2020, which was later reinstated by Joe Biden. Does it not show the lack of confidence of a global leader in a cause this important? The European Union has asked Austria to pay back 4 billion euros for not following the environmental policies put forward by it. An example that sanctions are being imposed at this very moment and have been majorly effective in this case as well. Veto powers, the most powerful nations in the world, are amongst the highest emitters of carbon dioxide. Which countries, I repeat, which countries have the strength to question these very individuals? Who will ask them questions? Who will be responsible for them, for their emissions of carbon dioxide? Be it the South Asian brown cloud or the Great Pacific Garbage Pact. Both events go unanswered for decades now. Russia, a major global leader, Russia has been very unambitious in regards of climate change in the past many decades. If climate change goes unanswered, it will not just be us who are put to danger, rather each and every generation after us. Some solutions put forward by the government were the allotment of funds to developing and poor countries, an agreeable fact which is being imposed at this very moment. Problems are caused due to sanctions. I agree, that is a fact. Disaster recovery causes major amounts of funds. Sanctions also lead to rise in agricultural prices. But climate change is equally responsible for the lack in development of this world. Heat waves and floods not just destroy livelihoods, they threat human life as well. Owing to the progress, nuclear weapons owned by major countries, including India, at the moment, these countries are major emitters of carbon dioxide and they need to be questioned. their policies need to be changed. As stated by the Deputy Leader of Opposition, it should not be the countries who should suffer. It should be the governments. But if and only if sanctions and pivotal decisions are imposed upon them, only and only then will the governments take an action. The very governments which the citizens themselves chose. I would like to raise my case over here. Thank you.
So, greetings to the House at large. I'd like to open my argument as the opposition whip by fortifying the arguments given by the opposition today. And I'd like to question the member of government for a minute. So, you said that you said a phrase that the citizens of a country are not exactly innocent. They are the industrialists and the rich people. I think you should know that a country is not just rich people, it's the needy, it's the poor, it's the one who need help, not just the rich people. I think you should know that. Moving further, I asked this house what exactly would be the authority that decides these sanctions that you ask for. Because from here, it looks like it will be these same countries that you ask us to condemn, the big economies, the large economies of this world. I ask you, who are at the head or the helm of the international organizations we have today? The UN. The veto countries, the same countries that are responsible for most of the carbon emission in this world today. How will you condemn them? They will be the authority, I suppose, because since they are at the helm of the UN, will you allow these, do you think these countries will put sanctions on themselves and pool their own resources to help countries in need? Do you think that will happen? Furthermore, I'd like to begin by fortifying the arguments given by the opposition today. We talk about cooperation. What do organizations like the UN were made for? Global cooperation, global incentive. We do not mean to put sanctions on countries. We do not need to have military action. And I'd also like to ask the opening government, when did we decide that wars and military action were the same thing? I don't believe it was stated in the House today. What was stated was that military action affects the citizens and it is unjust. That's what our point was. Furthermore, the resolution that we talk about. The first step to any solution is negotiation. If we don't negotiate, if we don't give them an incentive, then applying these sanctions, doing these actions, doing these borderline cruel things is simply unacceptable. Moving further, we talk about green technology. How would a nation improve its climate action situation? How would they take climate action? Two situations happen when a country is either negligent or abrasive towards the environment. And green technology is the way to help both these solutions. A country is abrasive towards the environment either because they don't have the technology or they simply choose not to use it. Again, these veto countries I talk about. And the ones that are negligent simply do not have the resources. These financial pools you talk of collected by the green countries, as so accurately said by the government was said that no real action is taken because no real technology is provided. If they don't have the resources, if they don't have the technology, how do you expect them to do it? Think of it like you give someone rice and ask them to make a chapati out of it. How does that make sense? How can you ask them to make resources, make technology when they don't have food to feed their own people? I go further and talk about humanitarianism. Right, the citizens that matter. It's not the governments, it's the citizens that we need to talk about today. I'll give you the example of Slovenia, one of the best countries to take example of successful climate action in the world today. Slovenia's Prime Minister talks heavily about global cooperation and incentive. I think you guys should look that up. Slovenia's example simply talks about the fact that how global cooperation and help from countries in the EU made sure that they could improve their economy. I'll also like to talk to you about Pakistan, a country in such turmoil that they don't even have the idea of climate action on their mind. Why do you think that is? Political instability? Lack of resources? Lack of power? I guess that's true. I'd also like to talk about how, just a second. I'll begin with my conclusion, that is, what your morally wrong action is that we let this negligence go on is exactly what we talk about. If we take these actions right here, right now, without negotiation, without incentive, do you think it is correct? Because how is it okay to directly ban something, to directly go to a country, to take military action without without incentive. I agree, situations like the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol have happened, which have given countries a sense of responsibility. But I talk about those who are in need. I don't talk about these giant countries, these mega economies. Talk about the countries that need help now. And I ask you, what would you do as a government to talk about these economies that sit at the helm of your power, at the helm of your organizations that will be the one responsible for taking these actions, I ask you. Furthermore, I'd like to ask this House that the organizations like UN were made to create a sense of responsibility amongst countries, if I'm not wrong. Yet the power of veto was given to the countries that were considered responsible, right? So for that point in time, why are these countries that are considered to be responsible the exact countries that at this moment in time are responsible for the highest amount of carbon emission in the world? And you talk about how countries are subjected, at the same time, the opening government also talked about how there's two types of countries in these situations. The ones that are developed and the ones that are underdeveloped. And then the opening government also proceeds to say that they are subjected. I don't think we can generalize countries in this manner. Every situation is different, and this committee that will decide these sanctions is where I ask you a question. Who will be the one to decide what these sanctions are, and who will be the ones to decide who are they imposed upon? With that, I rest my case. Thank you.
Fourth position for the junior category for not for international debate competition is Sanskriti and Siddhi from Kothari International School. The third position is occupied by Sayyid Saad and Safiya Sheikh from Pearls Academy. Now, I would request the team which gets the second position to please come on stage, and the team which has occupied the second position is Ahana and Otis from Sanjay Gulawat International School. By now, I'm assuming all of you all know who the first position is. And now I would invite Soumya and Bhavani from Cambridge Court Wall School. Please have a huge round of applause for the winning team. So guys, now